Hello everyone. So this is my fifth attempt, I think, at doing a review for this book. Um, yeah, it's quite a difficult one. First of all, quick preface. This is obviously the new format. It might end up being higher quality than it is currently in later reviews. This is currently 1280 by 720, I believe. Might bump that up to 1920 by 1080, just for various reasons. My laptop is pretty rubbish, so it takes a long time to render. Kind of makes it a hassle. And yeah, so I just want to just summarise really that it's kind of unfortunate, isn't it, that I did a decent amount of reviews, a lot of good books as well, in that sort of lower quality with the webcam. I think it was just for various reasons. It was just I had a whole setup there that just seemed familiar and quite fairly easy to set up. Actually, it turns out this is a lot easier though, just recording on my phone. So hopefully the background is good, and hopefully I can begin sort of with this new setup. Now, second thing, I think I'll start talking more about non-fiction books. I was slightly hesitant to do that because I don't really want to get into sort of personal details. However, talking about more cultural aspects and maybe my sort of worldview and whatnot. However, when I did the first two vlogs, I did find it quite enjoyable talking about other things. I felt like even though the reviews, my main channel content is broad in a sense that I'm covering other books, I think they were getting a little bit samey, perhaps. So this is obviously doing the vlogs and whatnot, sort of branching out, and now obviously doing non-fiction. Should be branching out more as well. So, actually, reminds me actually, I think I only did one non-fiction book. I think it was Enchanted: A History of Fantasy Illustration. I think that was the only one. But anyway, let's get into The Passion of the Western Mind before I go on too long. Now, The Passion of the Western Mind, I'll read the back just to start off with. It's a complete guide to Western civilization and the philosophical ideas that have shaped our worldview. From Plato to Hegel, from Augustine to Nietzsche, from Copernicus to Freud, Richard Tarnas describes profound philosophical concepts simply but without simplifying them. 10 years in the making. The Passion of the Western Mind was hailed as an instant classical in publication. In it, Tarnas provides a compelling account of the evolution of the Western mind and its changing conception of reality. This is quite a phenomenal book. It's it covers really, if you're familiar with these figures, like it covers everything from Democritus and Thales to Plato and Aristotle, all the way through to Aquinas and Wittgenstein and Hegel and postmodernism. It really covers everything. The book was written in 1991, however, I think it's very much pertinent to today, and it's covering such broad timescales and ideas that I think it really can be read even 10 years from now, or 20, 30 years from now possibly. It's got quite a modern outlook at the end as well. I'll probably get into that. Good synthesis. So this book, I think I read it in about 8 days. I think I read a review that someone read it in about a year and a half. That's not to knock the person, of course. It's I can imagine if you've got a job and other things going on, it would take a while to read this type of book, and a book this long. I just want to clarify there that I think with the notes it's about 460, I think, which isn't too bad for a fiction book, but for a book covering this subject, I can imagine it would take quite a long time. It definitely doesn't dumb things down as well. It's for the layperson, but I'll probably read some excerpts as well. It's quite detailed and in depth. I read it, however, in about 8 days because I was trying to take a more active approach, and I really just did nothing else but read. So I tried to. I'm fairly proud of that. Yeah. Also, it's just a very good book. That's why I read it in a decent amount of time. It's not a dry book at all. It's always aiming toward a synthesis. It's always aiming toward this grander picture. I found that in almost every section there is a synthesis of ideas, and there's this leads to that, and that leads to that, and A and B makes C, etc. It always has something to say. It's this grand narrative. It feels like a narrative, and actually, um, it reminded me very much of reading. To me, it feels like reading the Iliad, but in non-fiction form. It's the best way I can describe it. It's the closest sort of comparison that I can make. Uh, it really covers such a wide, sweeping narrative from Democritus and Thales all the way to postmodernism, and even at the very end, even beyond postmodernism. Um, really quite fascinating. I should say, this really it's not just about philosophy. It's about science, religion, culture, cultural achievements, technological improvements, politics, sociology, etc. It's got everything. Really, it's got everything. And I'll read a little bit of a section of a passage that of something that I wrote to a friend, just to give you an idea of the contents of the book. Just in a second. I found this to be a surprisingly moving book for a non-fiction book, especially. It's something very inspiring about it, and I think it's because it has this narrative feeling to it, where we start with the Greeks, and we end up in the modern day. It's obviously written in 1991, and well, technically 10 years probably before that, but of course this is applicable to, as I said earlier, it's applicable to probably people in the future as well. It's because we're dealing with such a broad subject. The way it's written as well, it seems like it does justice to the subject matter. We're dealing with Botticelli, we're dealing with Dante, Virgil, Wittgenstein, Hegel, Aquinas. We're dealing with all these, the movers and shapers of the Western world, and in some cases the entire world. And I want to say as well, actually, this reminds me, this isn't really a Western sort of polemic book. It's not the type of book that is saying the West is the best. That's not me saying that, obviously. That you do get books like that, of course. That's fine. This book is more of it takes a neutral stance. Richard Tarnas has something to say, but overall it takes a neutral stance, in the sense that we're just dealing with the chronology, and we're dealing with developments and whatnot. It's not saying that, it's not sort of passing a judgment. Apologies for the sound in the background there. It's not passing a judgment on the West or other cultures or whatever. So I'd just like to read this out again. Apologies for the noise in the background. This is something I said to a friend. It's about the sort of grand overview of this book, and I've just sort of highlighted in a somewhat of a chronological order. I've sort of highlighted the subjects it covers, just to give you an idea. So things like, for example, the first philosopher, Thales, Democritean atomism, Platonic ideal forms, leading on to Aristotelian concrete particulars, through to medieval scholasticism, Christian metaphysics, Occam's nominalism, Bruno, Newton, Locke, Berkeley, Rousseau's foundations, which obviously led to Romanticism, Humean, David Hume with his causality, Kant's categorical imperative, Hegel's dialectical teleology of the universal knowing, sort of grand narrative, his philosophy, Freud and Jungian depth psychology, archetypal thought, Camus and Sartre's existentialism. Then, of course, that leads on to postmodernism and absurdism, etc., etc. Or switch those two around. That's really what we're dealing with here. Now, first of all, I'm wary that it's kind of unfortunate. I'm wary these sorts of subjects have the tendency to kind of feel a bit pretentious. I certainly thought that as well. I thought that, for example, that if I had not read this book, I might have thought that this was all sophistry and semantics and sort of things that don't really matter, and just sort of intellectualism for intellectualism's sake, if you see what I mean. But when you actually do read the book, and there's this grand through line and narrative, you see how things progressed, it does make sense. And this is people striving to understand the West, to understand the world. And I say that because there's a section here that I want to read out. This is from the Wikipedia. So I probably couldn't myself summarize the synthesis of of this book, the sort of the thing that it's leading towards. However, I've got this nice summary here. So this might not make any sense if you're not familiar with the concepts, but this is where Tarnas is getting to basically. Tarnas's proposed way of this Cartesian Kantian epistemological box, which is basically the human limitation to understand objective reality, involves a participatory epistemology, a theory of knowledge in which human beings are regarded as an essential vehicle for the creative self-unfolding of reality. According to Tarnas, the participatory framework takes into account the critical insights of modernism and postmodernism, while repairing the ontological separateness of the psyche and the cosmos. So, for example, I can summarize it by saying humans are of the world and not of the world. We are of the mind but not of the mind. We are of nature but not of nature, etc., etc. It's a dualistic Cartesian sort of perspective. So while repairing the ontological separateness of the psyche and the cosmos, which are, in the participatory framework, synthesized in a dialectical hieros gamos, or sacred marriage. So essentially, the book really is all about synthesis. It really covers this idea of going from the sort of Judeo-Christian world. It goes from polytheism of the Greeks to the Judeo-Christian sort of patriarchal ordering, dualistic side of things, to a sort of to then going on to the sort of Kantian worldview, where we're limited, utterly limited, in the way that we view the world, and we'll never actually understand objective reality because there's that sort of break. We sort of come at things from the human mind orders things in a pre-made sort of way. I'll probably leave it there in terms of the explanation. So we will never be able to understand objective reality. However, there's this through line in narrative where being a participant in nature is what matters essentially. But this isn't a philosophy channel, so I don't want to really get into the details of that. But so there are two things here that I got out from reading this book. One is the sort of Christian aspect, this idea that it fascinated me just how much we have to really thank the Roman Catholic Church for sort of upholding Hellenic values and science in general, for example, with the Jesuits and whatnot. And something I mean, I've read a decent amount of history books and some philosophy books as well. I was never really quite aware until I read this book of just how much the church really was the foundation of science, especially, for example, when we came into the Renaissance. Just as an example, when we came into the Renaissance, that was really a Platonic movement. The humanists were a Platonic movement against the Aristotelian tradition of the Catholic Church. It's interesting, the Platonic humanists were actually more spiritual and religious than the Aristotelian Church. Hopefully that makes sense. If you're familiar with that, I don't want to go into too much about the history and philosophy and whatnot in this review. But that's just interested me, and it goes back to this idea of the book is always trying to set out the pros and cons of each era and each epoch and each mindset and worldview. There's always this leads to that and that leads to that, and it's always trying to look at things from a critical lens, and I found it fascinating. So many things in this book. Actually, I'm not sure, this is my 5th attempt at doing this review, so I'm not sure if I've done this yet, but I'll do it again. You can see here, just at the bottom of the book, this is my new way of, I've actually been doing it for a little while now, but it's my way of sort of highlighting parts of the book that I really enjoyed or found interesting, and you can see pretty much all of the book is like that. Somewhat negates the purpose actually, because obviously there's every page is pretty much bookmarked. So it's kind of makes it pointless, but whatever. Anyway, that's just to say that there's so much that I enjoyed in this book and so much interesting insight that I just could not help but just mark the page and say, oh, I need to get back to that, I need to remember that. There's just so much good stuff in here. So that was the Christian aspect. Just park that to one side for a moment. The second thing I want to talk about as well that I got from this book is this idea of the infallibility of science. Now, of course, I always knew that science is fallible. In many ways, it is our best way to understand the world around us, or is the best way. But I found it fascinating with Kant and Kuhn as well. Kant said that we will never be able to understand our objective reality because the human mind has its own ordering system that it puts on to in a sort of active way the phenomena of the world, essentially. And Kuhn, I think I remember this from my degree even, possibly. Kuhn said that we'll never, the sort of paradigm shifts, science always works in separate paradigms and they never really compare, and there's obviously always very much subjective things that go into science, and you can't really always have an objective viewpoint. So there's like ontological and epistemological and sociological and all different factors that essentially combine to say that science is flawed, even if it is our best way to understand the world. And I always felt myself shrinking from that type of idea, and especially at the end of this book, it talks a lot about biological mysticism and archetypal thought. And there's ideas that I found that I wasn't perceptive to, but over time I found it really fascinating. Like, for example, Hegel's idea of the grand cosmological narrative. Although that has a lot of problems, I found it fascinating, this idea of the world striving to know itself. It's like Carl Sagan's We Are a Way for the Universe to Know Itself, but in a genuine, like a sort of absolute sense. Obviously Hegel was a Christian, where he imagined that God, the world spirit of God, put itself into the human mind in a way to sort of transcend the human over time. And this, I think he said, this idea of opposites always striving to cohere into a single whole, and then from that there's always a new paradigm from the two opposites. So old and old makes new, or something like that. And there's so much. There's a wealth of knowledge and so much I've got from this. This idea of so there's this idea overall of taking science and taking more sort of mystical and participatory and nature-based sort of feminine fluidity, dynamic sort of points of view, and transcending that sort of science and non sort of science, and combining those to transcend it. Because it's actually saying that science, our worldview, might actually just be one step to something else. I found that fascinating. I wish I could go into it. I'm not as learned enough as I'd like to be to really sort of make the subject sort of clearer and describe it in a way that sort of makes sense. But so I was going to read some excerpts, but I think you get the idea in terms of the content. Suffice it to say, there's some sections where it feels like it's like you're reading Heidegger or something, like the being in itself of being, etc. Epistemological stuff, metaphysical ontology, epistemology. You get the idea. But it really is. I think there's something in here for everyone. Although it's flawed, and there's you can read on Wikipedia that of course it's a non-fiction book, so of course it's going to have different viewpoints. People are going to disagree with certain things. That's certainly the case for this, but overall I think it's an incredible survey and comprehensive overview of the Western mind, of science, of culture, of the great insights of the great philosophers and scientists and artists and writers as well. It just has everything for everyone, I think. That was a passion of the Western mind. I really wish I could talk more about the philosophical concepts, and I wish I was more learned so that I could sort of grasp these concepts and sort of transmit them in a way. But I guess we're not really a philosophical channel or anything like that, even close to that. But There we go, there's The Passing of the Western Mind. We'll call it my first non-fiction review. I'm sure I've done another one, I'm just forgetting it, but Passion of the Western Mind, Understanding the Ideas That Have Shaped Our Worldview, Richard Tarnas. Pretty phenomenal work. So thanks for watching, everyone. Hopefully you're enjoying the new format. We'll see where that goes. Until next time, cheers.